Isaiah said that every valley would be lifted and every mountain would be made low. We are gathered here today because there is something in us that believes that there is a voice in the wilderness that said every valley will be risen and every mountain will be lowered. A voice that declared that there would be a leveling of the playing field, so to speak. A voice that would find its way in the flesh of a carpenter from Nazareth who proclaimed that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Born of a woman named Mary who believed in a God who brought down the rulers from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. That is the Advent hope. That there might be a shifting of the circumstances in our lives. We've been barely making it in the valleys of the shadow of death. We've had our backs against the walls. We've been neglected and rejected. Some of us abused and mistreated, maybe overlooked and underappreciated, yet we still have a hope. Some way, somehow, God is going to turn it around, flip it upside down in our favor for the good of those who love her. This is the Advent hope as we watch and we wait for clues that God has not forgotten nor forsaken us. I don't know what you came here to do today. Maybe you came because the church is real pretty this time of year. We have poinsettias and Christmas trees and nice wreaths, but I know that I came because I have a sneaking suspicion that we are gathering with eager expectation, with great anticipation, looking for clues that God is with us, that God's presence goes before us and behind us, that whatever we are going through, it has not yet disqualified us from God's attentiveness. And this Advent hope is where we meet the desert matriarch, Hagar, today. They call her the desert matriarch because for the majority of her time in the biblical canon, she is in the wilderness. And so I invite you to join me with the reading of Genesis 21, verses 8 through 21. Genesis 21. I am reading from the New Revised Standard Version. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out Hagar with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of Hagar. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. As for the son of Hagar, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. And he lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother found a wife for him from the land of Egypt. The word of God for the people of God. This story is very similar to a story 5 chapters earlier. We are first introduced to Hagar in Genesis 16. When she is pregnant, she has been given to Abram by Sarah as a mistress, and she is pregnant with her child. She has not yet given birth to her child, but there are some similarities between Genesis 16 and Genesis 21 that we read, but there are also some key differences. And I point them out because there are folks who believe that these are the same stories, they just ended up in 2 different spots. But the differences are quite great. And so I point out to you that in chapter 16, Hagar is pregnant. In chapter 21, she is no longer pregnant. She has given birth to Ishmael, and Sarah has also given birth to Isaac. In chapter 16, Sarai tells Abram to do what he wants with Hagar. But in chapter 21, Sarah tells Abram what she wants to be done to Hagar. In chapter 16, Hagar runs away into the wilderness on her own. But in chapter 21, Sarah, who is frustrated with her, casts her out into the wilderness with her child, Ishmael. Regardless, the compilers of the stories, they put them together in this way. Perhaps there is something that we can parse out about God, about the 2 different moments in Hagar's life when she found herself in the desert. But even amidst the differences, there was one similarity. In both stories, Sarah is bitter. Now, I try to give Sarah the benefit of the doubt. Y'all know how I feel about women in the Bible, and I try to give Sarah the benefit of the doubt because we are aware and we must acknowledge that the role of the patriarchal retellings of these stories have often pitted these 2 women against each other. Sarah versus Hagar, and Leah versus Rachel, and Penina versus Hannah. We are aware of that, but I just can't shake the way Sarah treats Hagar in these stories. Sarah is bitter. Sarah was bitter before she became pregnant with Isaac, and she is bitter after she has given birth to Isaac. One would think that after she got what she prayed for, her disposition might have shifted. But we see here that she is just as nasty to Hagar now as she was in chapter 16. This just goes to show some of us that prosperity and success and getting what you want does not guarantee good character. It's almost as if outside success means nothing with a whole bunch of inward insecurities. It doesn't matter how much money you have, that you have the latest clothes on, that you go to all the fancy islands every birthday season, that you have all of the relationships you want and the children that you prayed for, that you got that promotion to the corner office with the good window and you have the titles and the awards and the accolades. If your inner being is still jacked up, if your insecurities have not been dealt with, the jealousy and that bitterness, that discontentment is not going anywhere. Sarah is bitter. Sarah got what she wanted, the child that she had prayed to God for, and instead of being grateful, she wants to hoard her son's inheritance. She doesn't like that Hagar and Ishmael are existing alongside her and Isaac, and that when the time comes, the 2 brothers, half-brothers, are going to have to split their father's inheritance. And so she tells Abraham to send Hagar away. I can't deal with her being around her and her son fighting for what's mine. Rabbi Joyce Gillespie says, she talks about the Bedouin people who currently live in the Negev desert in Palestine. And she says that they are a people native of the desert who have been displaced by the state of Israel. And her argument, the rabbi's argument, is that we do not need to repeat the sin of Sarah, who wants Isaac to receive every bit of inheritance from Abraham with nothing left for Ishmael. She calls them out and says, we do not need to repeat this cycle of disenfranchisement and this cycle of bitterness. At some point, we must repent for the way Sarah treated her. Sarah was bitter. And because of her bitterness, she sends Hagar away. But Abraham is uneasy about it, and so he goes to God and consults God, and God says, well, do whatever Sarah says. And so Hagar goes, but not without Abraham sending them with some bread and some water in a skin, with a baby on her shoulder and water on her shoulder, and I imagine bread in her hand, with a baby on her shoulder, without any clear direction or destination. Into the desert she goes for a new round of wandering and waiting. Wandering and weeping. She is in the dry place when her water runs out. She is in the desert. She is in a place that often feels like punishment. I guess she imagined at this moment that nothing could get worse, and just when she thought it couldn't get any worse, her water runs out. In the desert, in the place of divine punishment, it was thought to believe that God was punishing us when God would send us into these desert places. Why would God do such a thing? When her back is against the wall and she feels that life can't get any worse. How many of us have been there? It seems like nothing is going right. It's one thing after a next, and then we get a light bill that says it's going to cut our lights off if we're not careful, or we get that eviction notice right when we think things can't get any worse, right when we think we have already hit rock bottom. Hagar finds herself in the desert with her toddler without water. Rebecca Copeland reminds us that the story is set in the southernmost regions of Palestine, in and at the border of the Negev desert. What she lets us know is that there is little surface water available in these areas. Your best chance for water is if it's raining and a flash flood comes and you can gather some of it up, or some of it seeps underground, and perhaps maybe you can dig a well, but that's not even a guarantee, because sometimes when you dig, the water is too salty. And sometimes when you dig, the water is muddy. There is very few opportunities for fresh water in the desert. She reminds us that given the effort involved, the person who would dig a well would often commit the location to their memory, and then they would hide it because they didn't want anybody else to come and take their resources. They would dig the well and they would cover it up, but it was a labor-intensive activity to be digging in the mountains and in the deserts of the rocky climate of the Negev desert. I imagine in this portion of Hagar's journey, she was exhausted. She couldn't find a well. I imagine Hagar did not even have the strength to dig. I imagine that she was getting to the point of dehydration. Maybe her shoulder was aching because she had been carrying Ishmael all that way. And maybe in the midst of her exhaustion, she gives up hope. She places the baby under a bush. And the text says she turns away from him and begins weeping. I imagine that Hagar turns away because she doesn't want her child to see her crying. I don't know how many of you have been there with your children or stepchildren or grandchildren or your students that you teach. I remember when I was teaching middle school, and somebody had passed away, and I came to school the next day, and the kids, I had to turn away from them so they wouldn't see me tearing up. I don't know if you've been there when you've had to shield your children from your own grief because you don't want them to experience what you're experiencing. Hagar turns away, and she weeps. She weeps because she knows that if she does not find water soon, her child will die. She weeps because she knows that if she does not get to fresh water soon, the chances for life are slim. Hagar reminds me of some people. She is every mother in Gaza whose water supply has been cut off. She is every mother in Flint, Michigan, who has had to bathe her child with bottled water. She is every mother, every parent, every indigenous parent whose sacred water sources have been contaminated by leaking pipelines. She is every parent in the predominantly Black and Hispanic neighborhoods in Houston, Texas, and Jackson, Mississippi, who have to constantly boil their water for safety. Hagar weeps, she cries, and she licks her tears with the hope of hydration. And right when she is resigned to death, right when she has just about given up and thrown in the towel, she hears the voice of God. Hagar, what's going on, Hagar? What's wrong, Hagar? Or like Jesus said to Mary Magdalene at the tomb, why do you cry, Hagar? What is going on? God tells her, I've heard the boy's cries. I've heard your cries. Hagar, get up, girl. Lift up the boy. I will make a great nation of him. Do you not remember me? In the midst of her weeping, God appears. In the midst of her crying, God appears. This is why I love the hymn by Isaac Watts that says, I love the Lord, he heard my cry and pitied every groan. In the midst of her groaning, God shows up just in time. Just as she has resigned to death, but this is not where it stops. God's speech often is accompanied by God's provision. I'll say that again. God's speech is often accompanied by God's provision. You see, God is not like fickle human beings. We talk out the side of our mouths but have no action sometimes. Okay, God is not like us. We can talk a good game, but when it's time to walk the walk, we are nowhere to be found. But with God, God's provision accompanies speech. And in that moment, after he has spoken a promise to Hagar, God opens her eyes and a well appears. Y'all remember when I said earlier that Rebecca Copeland said that people used to dig wells and they used to hide them so that nobody else would get their resources? That's how we are as humans. We want everything to ourselves. We want to hoard the resources. We dig something, we find a source of life, and then we want to hold on to it. God unhides the well in this moment. In this moment, the wells that people have hidden, God makes them visible to Hagar. And when Hagar sees the water from the well, she remembers God. What does she remember? She remembers that back in chapter 16, when she was pregnant, and when she was in the wilderness and she had no water, a well appeared. And it was at that place that she is the first person in the biblical canon to name God. God, the one who saw me in the midst of my despair. And she names the well of the living one who sees. In this moment in chapter 21, she is having deja vu, some flashbacks back to chapter 16, because she is remembering who God was to her back then. And because she remembers what God did for her back then, she can have a hope that God will do it again. God did it before in 16 at the well, and God is doing it again in 21. And though she might be in the midst of despair, in the midst of depression, in the midst of dehydration, she remembers God, the one who saw her, The one who paid attention to her, and God paid attention to her so much that she named her child after God, Ishmael, which means the one who pays attention. She remembers God. She remembers that same God in this moment. And even though she cannot see how the promises of God are going to unfold in her life, she has a new trust and a new hope and a new resolution because she remembers God. To dismember means to take the pieces of the body apart. To remember means to put it back together. She puts the pieces of God back together. And her hope comes from that memory of God in 16. She has a hope for a future. And can I give you one more thing? Yeah, come on. Francis Clopper says that the water in the wilderness motif, or the motif of the miraculous spring in the desert, is found throughout the Hebrew Bible. Many of you have heard them before. I've preached on some of them. You know, Isaiah 43, 18 and 19. God will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. This was a common motif, but this is the first time God has done it, which means that Hagar is the first recipient of God's miraculous water in the wilderness miracles. She is the first person who receives this new thing that God is doing in the world. Before God parts the Sea of Reeds and leads the people through in Exodus, Hagar met God with the water in the wilderness. Before God made water come from a rock, Hagar was the recipient of God's water in the wilderness. Hagar, the beneficiary of God's new thing that God is doing in the world. She sees the well and she remembers God. And it reminds me that where there is water in the desert, there is divine presence. Beloved, I don't know about you, but I know that there is so much happening in the world. There is so much that can weigh us down and weigh on us. There are global conflicts and crises. There are personal crises. There are some of you in here who might not even know where your next meal is coming from. I know that things are hard and that we are full of despair, and it is so easy to slip into a hopelessness. But in those moments, I dare us to remember who God has been for us. To put the pieces of God's appearances, theophany, back together again. To remember that if God showed up before, that God would do it again. That if God was with us before, that God would be with us now. Hagar offers us that example this morning. I believe that when Hagar saw the well, there was what I like to call a spirit of be all rightness. There was a spirit of all rightness that accosted her. She might not have seen the light at the end of the tunnel. She might not have known what her full redemption might look like. But I imagine her at the well singing to Ishmael, I got a feeling everything's gonna be all right. Oh, I've got a feeling everything's gonna be all right. Oh, I've got a feeling everything's gonna be all right. Be all right. Be all right. Be all right. I don't know what it might look like, God, but I have a feeling because I am in the presence of the unhidden well in the wilderness. I don't know how it's going to turn out. I don't know all the pieces of the story, but I have a feeling that everything's going to work together for my good because you said so. I don't know where you are. I can't see you right now. I might not even be able to feel you right now, but I have a feeling that it's going to be all right in this season. I hope that somebody leaves here today able to sing. The song sometimes says, the Holy Ghost done told me, and a host of other people, Jesus done told me that everything. Well, today my song is, Hagar, she done told me everything's gonna be all right. Oh, Hagar, she done told me was a scholar named Antoine de Saint-Exupéry who once said, what makes the desert beautiful is that somewhere in it hides a well. And so my prayer for us today is that we find the wells in our lives, that God leads us to the well, that God uncovers the wells for us, and maybe the well is not an actual literal well, but it's a person. One of my people used to say she would tell her nephew who lives with schizophrenia when he felt like he was coming up on an episode to find the helper, to find the wells in our lives, to find the people who can offer provision for us in the midst of the desert, in the midst of the wilderness. That is my hope today for you. My prayer is that we might unhide the wells, perhaps that we might become them for someone, so that someone can sing the Be All Right song, that they will be overwhelmed with the spirit of be all rightness, even in the midst of their despair. Let it be so. Stand if you are able and sing with us your Be All Right song. And guess what? I want you to call out whoever it is that has inspired you to be all right in this season.